The letter arrived at the telegraph office in Steins Pass, New Mexico Territory, on a blistering afternoon in August of 1883. Addressed to Xavier Owens, and when he opened it with hands calloused from years of ranch work, he never expected his entire world to shift on its axis before the month ended. Xavier stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by honest labor, his dark hair perpetually sun-streaked from long days working cattle across the sprawling acreage he had inherited from his late father. At 26, he had resigned himself to a solitary existence managing the ranch with only his hired hands for company, until his sister Martha had taken it upon herself to place an advertisement for a mail-order bride on his behalf. The letter confirmed that Penelope Brennan would arrive on the stage from Santa Fe in 3 days' time. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, his jaw tightening at the thought of Martha's interference. Yet he could not deny the loneliness that crept into his bones during the long evenings when the work was done, and silence filled the ranch house like an unwelcome guest. Perhaps Martha had been right to meddle. Perhaps it was time to build something more than just a successful cattle operation. 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Xavier found himself cleaning parts of the house that had not seen a proper scrubbing in years, much to the amusement of his ranch foreman, Cole, who teased him mercilessly about finally acting like a civilized man instead of a hermit. The day of Penelope's arrival, Xavier bathed and dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit he had worn only twice since purchasing it 2 years prior, and rode into town on his bay gelding. Steins Pass was not much to speak of, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the main road that connected larger towns in the territory. The general store, saloon, telegraph office, and a handful of other establishments served the ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding land. Xavier tied his horse outside the stage office and waited, his stomach churning with an unfamiliar nervousness. The stage arrived late, as it often did, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. Xavier watched as the driver climbed down and began unloading luggage. A single passenger emerged, and Xavier's breath caught despite himself. Penelope Brennan was not what he had expected. She was small and slender, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet, and eyes the color of storm clouds that regarded him with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She wore a practical traveling dress in dark blue, and she clutched a worn leather bag as though it contained everything precious she owned. Xavier removed his hat and approached her. "Miss Brennan, I am Xavier Owens." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she set down her bag and withdrew a small slate and piece of chalk from her pocket. With careful, practiced movements, she wrote, "I cannot speak. I hope this does not change your intentions." Xavier stared at the words, his mind racing. The advertisement, the letters exchanged through an agency, none had mentioned this. He looked up to find Penelope watching him with guarded eyes, her shoulders tense as though bracing for rejection. In that moment, he saw the courage it must have taken for her to travel across the territory to meet a stranger, knowing this revelation awaited. "It changes nothing," he said firmly. "I gave my word and I keep my promises. Welcome to Steins Pass." Relief flooded her features so completely that Xavier felt something shift in his chest. She erased the slate and wrote again, "Thank you. I will work hard and be a good wife." The marriage took place the following morning at the small church on the edge of town, officiated by Reverend Williams, with Martha and her husband Thomas serving as witnesses. Martha had tears in her eyes throughout the brief ceremony, clearly moved despite her usual practical demeanor. Penelope wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that Martha had helped her select from the general store, and she carried a handful of wildflowers that Martha had gathered that morning. Xavier found himself studying his new wife during the ceremony, noting the graceful way she held herself, the intelligence evident in her eyes. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Xavier leaned in to kiss her cheek, she smelled of lavender soap and something else, something sweet he could not quite identify. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, though not uncomfortably so. Penelope sat beside Xavier on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze taking in the landscape. The land here was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, the mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Xavier found himself wanting to explain things to her, to point out landmarks and share the history of the land, but he hesitated, uncertain how to navigate conversation with someone who could not respond in kind. Finally, he simply began to talk, describing the ranch and what her days might look like, the rhythm of life in this remote place. He told her about the cattle, the hired hands who lived in the bunkhouse, the challenges of raising livestock in such an unforgiving climate. Penelope listened attentively, occasionally nodding or offering small smiles that encouraged him to continue. When they arrived at the ranch house, Xavier helped her down from the wagon. The house was modest but well built, constructed of adobe and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Inside, Xavier had done his best to make it welcoming, though he knew it lacked the feminine touches a woman might prefer. Penelope explored the space with obvious interest, running her fingers along the rough-hewn furniture, examining the kitchen with its cast-iron stove and simple cabinets. She turned to Xavier and wrote on her slate, "It is a good home. I am grateful." That first week passed in a series of adjustments and discoveries. Xavier quickly learned that Penelope was an excellent cook, transforming his usual simple fare into meals that actually had flavor and variety. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, cleaning and organizing without disturbing the essential character of the space. More than once, Xavier returned from working with the cattle to find small improvements. Curtains hung in the windows, herbs growing in pots by the kitchen door, his shirts mended and pressed. Communication developed its own rhythm. Penelope carried her slate constantly, writing brief messages that conveyed her thoughts with surprising eloquence. Xavier found himself talking more than he had in years, filling the silence with observations about the ranch, stories from his past, questions about her life before Stein's pass. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away, they would sit together on the porch. Xavier would read aloud from books or newspapers while Penelope mended clothes or worked on a piece of embroidery Martha had given her. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and crimson as it sank behind the mountains. It was during these quiet moments that Xavier began to understand something he had never considered before. Silence was not the absence of communication, but rather a different form of it entirely. He learned to read Penelope's expressions, the subtle shifts in her posture that indicated amusement, concern, or contentment. He discovered that she had a delightful laugh, soundless but visible in the way her shoulders shook, and her eyes crinkled with genuine mirth. One evening, about 3 weeks after their marriage, Xavier was reading from a book of poetry when he glanced up to find Penelope watching him with an expression he could not quite interpret. He set the book aside. "What is it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then wrote, "Why did you agree to marry someone you had never met?" Xavier considered the question carefully. "Loneliness, I suppose. This ranch was my father's dream, and after he died, I poured everything into making it successful. But success feels hollow when you have no one to share it with. Martha saw that before I was willing to admit it myself. Penelope nodded slowly, then wrote, "I understand loneliness. Will you tell me about your life before?" Xavier asked. "Only if you want to." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers playing with the chalk. Then she began to write, erasing and rewriting as she shared her story in fragments. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a schoolteacher. A childhood illness had taken her voice when she was 7 years old. Her father had died when she was 18, and her mother had passed 2 years later, leaving Penelope alone and with limited means to support herself. The agency that arranged mail-order marriages had seemed like an opportunity for a new beginning, a chance to build a life that was not defined by pity or limitation. Xavier listened, his respect for her growing with each revelation. "You are very brave," he said when she finished. She shook her head and wrote, "Not brave, just determined to make something of the life I've been given." As autumn arrived and the heat of summer began to fade, Xavier found himself increasingly aware of Penelope in ways that went beyond simple companionship. He noticed the way afternoon light caught in her hair, turning it to burnished copper. He found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to see the smile that brightened her face when he returned from working the ranch. At night, lying in his bed while she slept in the room he had given her, he thought about what it might be like to truly share his life with her, to build not just a partnership but a genuine marriage. He was not sure she felt the same way. Penelope was unfailingly kind and helpful, an excellent manager of their household, but she maintained a certain reserve that he hesitated to breach. Their marriage had been one of convenience and necessity, and he would not presume to demand more than she was willing to give. The situation came to a head in late October when Xavier was injured while working with a particularly stubborn horse. The animal, spooked by a rattlesnake, had reared and thrown him against the corral fence. Xavier managed to walk back to the house under his own power, but his ribs ached fiercely and his head throbbed where he had struck it against a fence post. Penelope met him at the door, her eyes widening in alarm when she saw the blood on his shirt. She guided him to a chair with surprising strength for someone so small, then fetched water and clean cloths. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she cleaned the wound on his head, her face close to his as she worked. Xavier found himself studying her features. The small scar near her left eyebrow, the dusting of freckles across her nose, the intensity of her concentration. When she met his eyes, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building for weeks. "Penelope," he said softly, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She set aside the cloth and picked up her slate. "You frightened me. When I saw you hurt, I realized how much I have come to care for you." "I care for you too," Xavier admitted. "More than I expected to. More than I probably should, given the circumstances of our arrangement." She shook her head firmly and wrote, "This is not just an arrangement anymore, not for me." Xavier reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Not for me either." That night marked a shift in their relationship. Though they still maintained separate bedrooms, there was a new intimacy between them, a tenderness in their interactions that had not been there before. Xavier began to find small gifts left for him. His favorite coffee prepared just the way he liked it, a new pair of work gloves to replace his worn ones, wildflowers in a jar on his bedside table. He reciprocated with gestures of his own. He built her a writing desk and placed it by the window in her room where the light was best. He brought her books from the general store, learning her preferences through trial and error. When he discovered she loved music despite not being able to create it with her voice, he purchased a small music box that played a delicate waltz, and the joy on her face when he presented it to her was worth 10 times what he had paid. Winter arrived with surprising force that year, bringing snow that blanketed the landscape in white. The work of the ranch continued despite the cold, but the shortened days meant more time spent indoors. Xavier and Penelope fell into comfortable routines. Breakfast together before Xavier headed out to tend the cattle, lunch when he returned briefly at midday, long evenings by the fire. It was during one of these evenings that Penelope set aside her embroidery and wrote on her slate, "I would like to share your room." As a true wife, Xavier's heart hammered in his chest as he read the words. He looked up to find her watching him with a mixture of hope and nervousness that mirrored his own feelings. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I do not want you to feel obligated." She wrote quickly, "I feel no obligation. I feel love." The word hung between them, profound and transformative. Xavier set the slate aside and took both her hands in his. "I love you too, Penelope. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day you arrived, though I was too stubborn to recognize it." She smiled, that beautiful expression that lit up her entire face, and leaned forward to kiss him. It was their first real kiss, sweet and tentative and full of promise. When they parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I never imagined I could be this happy," he whispered. Penelope reached for her slate. "Neither did I. I thought I would always be alone, that no one would want a wife who could not speak. You have given me more than a home. You have given me a place where I belong." Their marriage became a true union that night, and in the weeks that followed, Xavier marveled at how seamlessly they fit together. He learned new ways to communicate, developing a sensitivity to unspoken cues that enriched his understanding not just of Penelope but of the world around him. The silence they shared was not empty but full of meaning, a space where connection happened on a deeper level than mere words could convey. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers covering the hills, and with it came news that Penelope was expecting their first child. Xavier received the information with a joy so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. He pulled Penelope into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing though hers made no sound. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." Penelope wrote, "I hope I can be a good mother even though I cannot sing lullabies or call out if there is danger." Xavier cupped her face in his hands. "You will be an excellent mother. Our child will learn that love is not just spoken. It is shown through actions, through presence, through the kind of devotion you demonstrate every single day. And I will do the calling out if there is danger." As Penelope's pregnancy progressed, Xavier found himself even more protective of her, though she remained remarkably capable and independent. She continued to manage the household with efficiency, though he insisted she rest more and avoid heavy work. He hired a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, whose husband worked at the general store, to come help with the more strenuous chores. Mrs. Chen was a practical woman who had immigrated from China years before, and she and Penelope developed an easy rapport despite their different backgrounds. Mrs. Chen did not seem bothered by Penelope's inability to speak, communicating through a combination of gestures, written notes, and an intuitive understanding that Xavier found remarkable. "Your wife is strong," Mrs. Chen told Xavier one day as she was leaving. "The baby will be strong too." The baby arrived on a warm evening in early September of 1884, after a labor that lasted most of the day. Martha came to help, along with the midwife from town, Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Xavier paced the porch, listening to the sounds from inside the house and feeling utterly helpless. When Martha finally emerged, her face was glowing with happiness. "You have a son, Xavier." And Penelope did beautifully. Xavier rushed inside to find Penelope propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. He approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son's small face. "He is perfect," Xavier whispered. "You are perfect." Penelope's eyes shimmered with tears as she carefully handed the baby to Xavier. The infant was tiny in his large hands, a warm weight that felt both fragile and solid. The baby's eyes were closed, his little fists waving gently in the air. They named him Joseph, after Xavier's father, and he became the center of their world. Xavier had worried that Penelope might struggle with motherhood given her inability to make sound, but those concerns proved unfounded. She was attentive and loving, finding creative ways to soothe and communicate with their son. She created a series of gentle touches and gestures that Joseph learned to recognize, and she wore a small bell on her wrist so the baby would know when she was near. Xavier often woke in the night to find Penelope sitting in the rocking chair he had made for her, Joseph cradled against her chest as she rocked him back to sleep. Though she could not sing lullabies, she hummed, the vibration of it something Joseph could feel even if there was no audible sound. Xavier would watch them in the lamplight, his heart so full it ached with the beauty of it. As Joseph grew, he proved to be a healthy, happy child with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. He was exceptionally observant, learning to read facial expressions and gestures earlier than most children, because that was how his mother communicated with him. By the time he was 2, he understood that his mother was different from other mothers, but it did not diminish his love for her in the slightest. "Mama," he would say, tugging on Penelope's skirt to get her attention, and she would kneel down to his level, giving him her full focus in a way that made him feel like the most important person in the world. Xavier taught his son to ride as soon as Joseph was big enough to sit a horse, and the boy took to it naturally. They would ride out across the ranch together, Xavier pointing out landmarks and teaching Joseph about the land, the cattle, the rhythms of ranch life. Penelope would watch them from the porch, and Xavier always made sure to turn in the saddle and wave to her, Joseph mimicking the gesture with enthusiastic, exaggerated movements. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm over the next few years. The ranch prospered under Xavier's management, allowing them to expand their herd and make improvements to the property. They built an addition onto the house, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Penelope created a garden that became the envy of the neighboring ranches, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers that transformed their homestead into something beautiful. In 1887, when Joseph was 3, Penelope became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder on her, and Xavier worried constantly despite the midwife's assurances that everything was progressing normally. He hovered over Penelope, earning gentle scolding through her written notes telling him to stop fussing. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1888, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and sent sheets of rain across the land. The birth was difficult, and there were moments when Xavier feared he might lose Penelope. He prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life, making bargains with God while Martha held his hand and told him to have faith. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, followed by Mrs. Patterson's announcement that both mother and child were well, Xavier's knees nearly buckled with relief. He entered the bedroom to find Penelope pale but smiling, holding a tiny daughter with a surprising amount of dark hair. "She is beautiful," Xavier said, tears streaming down his face without shame. "And you are the bravest person I have ever known." They named her Clara after Penelope's mother, and she proved to be as different from Joseph as 2 children could be. Where Joseph was quiet and observant, Clara was energetic and expressive from the moment she entered the world. She had Xavier's dark hair but Penelope's delicate features, and she ruled the household with an iron fist despite her tiny size. Joseph adored his sister, treating her with a gentleness that belied his young age. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, telling her stories and showing her his treasures. Interesting rocks, feathers, small carved animals Xavier had made for him. Clara would watch him with intense focus, as though understanding every word. As the children grew, they developed their own way of communicating with their mother. They learned that a touch on the arm meant Penelope wanted their attention, that certain facial expressions conveyed approval or concern or amusement. They also learned basic written communication earlier than most children, as Penelope would write simple words for them to read. One evening, when Joseph was 6 and Clara was 2, Xavier sat on the porch with Penelope after the children were asleep. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. "You remember when you first arrived here?" he asked. "I was so nervous I could barely speak. I had no idea what to expect." Penelope smiled and reached for the slate she kept nearby. She wrote, "I remember thinking you were the most handsome man I had ever seen, and then I was terrified you would send me away when you learned about my voice. I am grateful every day that you took that risk," Xavier said. "My life before you was half a life, though I did not realize it until you showed me what I was missing." She wrote, "You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me love when I thought no one would want me. You gave me children and a life beyond anything I dared to dream. I am the grateful one." Xavier pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes from years of deep understanding and shared experience. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind rustled through the cottonwood trees near the house. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Joseph grew tall and serious, with a natural affinity for animals and the land. He would spend hours with his father, learning the skills needed to run the ranch, but he was equally comfortable sitting quietly with his mother, the two of them communicating in their special silent language. Clara grew into a spirited child with a quick mind and an infectious laugh. She was fiercely protective of her mother, often explaining to visitors or new acquaintances that her mama could not talk but could hear perfectly well and understood everything. She seemed to view her mother's silence not as a limitation, but simply as one of many characteristics that made Penelope who she was. In 1892, when Joseph was 8 and Clara was 4, Xavier decided to expand the ranch's operations to include horse breeding. He had always had an eye for good horse flesh, and he believed there was a market for quality horses in the growing territory. Penelope supported the idea, though she wrote concerns about the additional risk and investment required. Xavier brought in a master horseman named Daniel Gray to help establish the breeding program. Daniel was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked with horses his entire life and had a reputation for being able to gentle even the most difficult animals. He was also, Xavier discovered, partially deaf from an accident years before. Daniel and Penelope developed an immediate understanding, two people who navigated a world that relied heavily on spoken communication without full access to it themselves. Daniel taught the family some basic hand signs he had learned, expanding their ability to communicate. He also had a gift for working with the children, patiently teaching them about horses and ranching while respecting their mother's unique situation. The horse breeding operation proved successful, and within a few years, Xavier's ranch was known throughout the territory for producing quality animals. The additional income allowed them to further improve their property and put money aside for the children's future. Life was not without its challenges. There were seasons of drought that tested their resilience, cattle that fell ill despite their best efforts, the constant physical demands of ranch life. There were also moments of heartbreak, like when Martha died suddenly in 1893 from a fever that took her before anyone could react. Xavier grieved deeply for his sister, the one who had cared enough to meddle in his life and bring Penelope to him. During that difficult time, Penelope was his anchor. She held him when he wept, sat with him in his silence, reminded him through her presence that life continued and there were still reasons to hope. Joseph and Clara, sensing their father's pain, were on their best behavior, offering childish comfort in the form of hugs and small gifts they made themselves. Martha's death brought Thomas and their 2 children to visit more often, and the cousins became close despite living several hours apart. Xavier made a point of maintaining that connection, understanding that family was precious and not to be taken for granted. As the children entered their teenage years, they began to truly understand and appreciate their mother's strength. Joseph, now 14 and already nearly as tall as his father, would tell anyone who would listen that his mother was the smartest person he knew. He had learned so much from her about observation, about patience, about finding creative solutions to problems. Clara, at 10, was equally devoted. She had decided she wanted to become a teacher, inspired by watching her mother teach her and Joseph to read and write. She wanted to help other children who might be different or face challenges that others did not understand. One evening in 1896, as Xavier and Penelope prepared for bed, she handed him a note she had written earlier. It was longer than her usual brief messages, clearly something she had taken time to compose. It read, "I have been thinking about our life together and how unexpected it has been. I came to New Mexico expecting duty and perhaps companionship at best. Instead, I found love beyond measure. You could have rejected me when you learned I could not speak. You could have treated me as less than whole. Instead, you saw me as complete. You taught our children to value silence and observation, to communicate with more than just words. You built a life with me, not for me. Every day I wake grateful for the chance encounter that brought us together. Every night I sleep content knowing I am loved for who I am, not despite who I am. You are the best man I have ever known, and I love you with everything I am." Xavier read the note twice, his vision blurring with tears. When he looked up, Penelope was watching him with those storm-gray eyes that had first captured his attention 13 years before. He set the note aside carefully and pulled her into his arms. "I am the one who is grateful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed everything. You made this house a home. You made me a better man. You gave me children who are growing into remarkable people because they have you as an example. The silence we share is the loudest declaration of love I have ever known." They held each other for a long moment, communicating in the way they had perfected over years of marriage. Through touch, through presence, through the deep understanding that comes from truly seeing another person. The ranch continued to thrive as the century drew to a close. Joseph began taking on more responsibility, showing a natural aptitude for leadership and a deep respect for the land. Clara excelled in her studies, her dream of becoming a teacher growing stronger each year. Xavier and Penelope watched their children grow with pride, knowing they had created something lasting and good. In 1898, when an opportunity arose to purchase adjacent land from a retiring rancher, Xavier and Penelope discussed it at length. It would be a significant investment, but it would also secure the ranch's future and provide opportunities for their children. Penelope wrote out detailed calculations and considerations, and together they decided to move forward with the purchase. The expansion meant hiring additional help, and Xavier brought on several young men looking for honest work. He ran the ranch with fairness and integrity, values Penelope reinforced through her own actions. The workers quickly learned that Mrs. Owens might not speak, but she communicated clearly and expected respect and hard work in return. One of the young workers, a man named Peter, had a younger sister who was also mute. When he learned about Penelope, he asked if his sister might visit sometime, to meet someone else who shared her experience. Penelope immediately agreed, and the visit resulted in a friendship that enriched both women's lives. Sarah, Peter's sister, was 20 years old and had felt isolated in her small town. Meeting Penelope, seeing her successful marriage and family, gave Sarah hope for her own future. Penelope began writing letters to Sarah, long, detailed letters that Sarah treasured. They shared experiences, frustrations, joys, and slowly Sarah's confidence grew. When Sarah eventually met and married a kind farmer who valued her for who she was, she credited Penelope with showing her it was possible. These moments of connection and impact reminded Xavier of the ripple effects of love and acceptance. By building a life with Penelope based on respect and understanding, they had created an example that touched others. Joseph and Clara grew up knowing that differences were not deficits, that communication took many forms, that love was shown through action as much as words. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. On New Year's Eve of 1899, the family gathered together on the porch despite the cold, watching the stars and contemplating the future. Joseph was 16 now, Clara 12, both on the cusp of young adulthood. Xavier looked at his family, this incredible gift he had been given, and raised a glass of cider and a toast. To the new century, and to the blessings we share, may we continue to face whatever comes with love and courage. Penelope raised her own glass, her eyes shining in the lamplight. Clara and Joseph echoed their father's toast, and they drank together, a family united by bonds deeper than blood. The early years of the new century brought changes both expected and unexpected. Joseph began courting a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a sensible girl named Alina who treated Penelope with warmth and respect. Clara continued her education, determined to attend the new teachers' college that had opened in Silver City. Xavier, now 43, found himself reflecting often on the path his life had taken. The ranch was successful beyond his father's dreams, his children were healthy and happy, and his marriage was stronger than ever. He and Penelope had developed a partnership so complete that they often knew what the other was thinking without any communication at all. One spring morning in 1902, as they walked together through Penelope's garden, Xavier stopped and turned to face his wife. She looked up at him questioningly, and he took both her hands in his. "I have something I want to say, and I need you to just listen," he began. "When you arrived in Stein's Pass 19 years ago, I was existing, not living. I had convinced myself that work and success were enough, that I did not need anything more. But you showed me what I was missing. Not just companionship or partnership, though we have both of those in abundance. You showed me that real communication, real connection, goes far deeper than words. You taught me to pay attention, to observe, to listen with more than just my ears." Penelope's eyes glistened with tears, but she remained still, letting him continue. "The silence we share is not empty. It is full of meaning, full of understanding, full of love so profound it takes my breath away. I know I told you I loved you years ago, but I want you to know that what I feel for you has only grown deeper with time. You are my partner, my love, my best friend. Everything good in my life exists because you took a chance on a lonely rancher who was too stubborn to admit he needed someone." He released one of her hands to wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I just wanted you to know that. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything is right, and I do not tell you often enough how grateful I am." Penelope pulled one hand free and reached for the small slate she still carried, though she needed it less often these days. She wrote carefully, "You show me every day through your actions, through the way you look at me, through the life we have built together. I never imagined this kind of happiness was possible. You are my miracle, Xavier Owens. My quiet, wonderful miracle." They stood in the garden surrounded by the flowers Penelope had cultivated, the fruits of years of patient care, and kissed in the morning sunlight. Around them, the ranch hummed with activity, but in that moment they were alone in their shared silence, a silence that spoke more eloquently than any words could. Joseph married a leaner in the summer of 1903, a joyous celebration that brought together friends and family from across the territory. Penelope helped Alina prepare for the wedding, sharing wisdom about marriage and life through written notes and gentle guidance. Alina confided to Xavier that she felt blessed to have Penelope as a mother-in-law, that she had learned more about true communication from watching Xavier and Penelope together than from anyone else in her life. The young couple built a small house on the ranch property, Joseph taking on more and more of the daily operations as Xavier began to step back slightly. It gave Xavier more time with Penelope, more time to simply enjoy the life they had created. Clara left for Teachers College in 1904, a bittersweet moment for both Xavier and Penelope. Their daughter was following her dreams, but the house felt emptier without her vibrant presence. She wrote long letters home, detailing her studies and experiences, and Penelope would read them over and over, pride evident in every line of her face. In 1905, Joseph and Alina welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Penelope after her grandmother. Xavier watched his wife hold her namesake for the first time, and the tenderness on her face made his heart swell. She wrote to young Penelope on her slate, even though the baby could not yet read, "Welcome to the family, little one. You are already so loved." Clara returned home after completing her studies and took a position teaching at the school in Steins Pass. She had grown into a confident young woman with her mother's grace and her father's determination. She moved back into the ranch house temporarily, filling it once again with energy and laughter. The years flowed by like water in the stream that ran through their property, constant and steady. Joseph and Alina had 2 more children, twin boys they named James and John. Clara met and married a doctor named Robert Foster, who had recently moved to the area, and they settled in Steins Pass where both could pursue their professions. Xavier and Penelope became doting grandparents, their home often filled with the sounds of children playing. Penelope delighted in teaching the grandchildren the same way she had taught her own children, with patience and creativity and endless love. The grandchildren never thought it strange that their grandmother did not speak. It was simply who she was, and they loved her unreservedly. In 1910, as Xavier approached his 53rd birthday and Penelope her 45th, they took a trip to Santa Fe, something they had talked about for years but never quite managed. They stayed in a proper hotel, ate at restaurants, visited museums and galleries. It was a second honeymoon of sorts, a chance to focus entirely on each other away from the responsibilities of ranch and family. One evening, as they sat in their hotel room watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Penelope wrote Xavier a note. "Thank you for this adventure. Thank you for 27 years of adventures. Thank you for choosing me. Every single day, Xavier read the note and pulled her close. Choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made. Loving you is as natural as breathing. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. They returned home refreshed and even more appreciative of what they had built together. The ranch was now run primarily by Joseph, who had proven himself a capable and innovative manager. Xavier still helped with major decisions and enjoyed working with the horses, but he no longer bore the daily burden of responsibility. This newfound freedom allowed Xavier and Penelope to travel more, to visit Clara and Robert in town, to spend extended time with the grandchildren. They took long rides across the property, just the two of them, visiting favorite spots and reminiscing about their years together. In 1912, Clara gave birth to her first child, a son named Xavier after his grandfather. The honor touched Xavier deeply, and when Clara placed the infant in his arms, he felt the full circle of life in a way he never had before. This tiny person would carry his name forward, would grow up hearing stories about his grandparents and their unique love story. As Xavier held his grandson, Penelope, beside him, he thought about the letter that had arrived all those years ago, announcing her impending arrival. He thought about his nervousness, his uncertainty, his fear, and he thought about how completely wrong he had been to worry. Penelope had not been a risk or a challenge to overcome. She had been exactly what he needed, exactly when he needed it. Their inability to communicate in traditional ways had forced them to develop something deeper, something more profound. The silence they shared had taught him to truly listen, to observe, to connect on a level most people never experienced. As the years continued to pass, Xavier and Penelope settled into a comfortable rhythm. They were older now, moving a bit slower, but their love had not diminished. If anything, it had strengthened, tested, and proven through decades of shared experiences. They still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sunset and enjoying each other's company. Sometimes Xavier would read aloud, his voice perhaps a bit rougher with age but still strong. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, holding hands, content in the knowledge that they were together. The grandchildren grew, and eventually there were great-grandchildren as well. The ranch continued to prosper under Joseph's management, the land that had been Xavier's father's dream now supporting multiple generations of the family. In 1918, as the world beyond New Mexico was engulfed in war and change, life on the ranch remained relatively stable. Xavier was 61 now, Penelope 53, and they spent more time reflecting on their life together, on the incredible journey they had shared. One evening, as they sat together watching yet another beautiful sunset, Xavier turned to Penelope. "You ever regret it? Coming all this way to marry a stranger?" Penelope smiled and shook her head. She no longer needed her slate for simple communication with Xavier. He could read her expressions, her gestures, the language they had developed over 35 years of marriage. But for something this important, she reached for the slate she kept nearby. She wrote, "My only regret is that I did not meet you sooner. Every moment with you has been a gift. You gave me a voice through your love, through the way you listened to me, through the family we created together. I would travel 1,000 miles again for one day with you." Xavier felt tears prick his eyes, something that happened more easily now than when he was younger. "I love you, Penelope Brennan Owens. I have loved you since the moment you stepped off that stage with courage in your eyes and hope in your heart. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They sat together as the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Around them, the ranch settled into evening quiet, cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in their corrals, the gentle sounds of a life well lived, Years continued to add up, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. They mourned the loss of friends and loved ones, celebrated the births of new generations, watched the world change around them while their love remained constant. In 1923, on their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Joseph and Alina were there with their children and grandchildren. Clara and Robert came with their growing family. The house and grounds were filled with people, all connected by the love story that had started with a letter and a leap of faith. During the celebration, Joseph stood and raised a glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled family. "They taught me that love is not about perfect circumstances or easy paths. They showed me that true partnership means accepting each other completely, communicating in whatever way works, and building something lasting through dedication and respect. Their marriage has been an example to all of us, a reminder that the best things in life often come from taking risks and opening our hearts." Everyone raised their glasses, calling out congratulations and well wishes. Xavier looked at Penelope and she looked back at him, and in that moment they were young again, meeting for the first time in Stein's Pass all those years ago. As the celebration continued around them, Xavier leaned close to Penelope and whispered, 40 years, and I would do it all again." Penelope placed her hand over his heart, a gesture that meant more than any words could convey. Her eyes, still that same storm gray that had captivated him decades before, were filled with love and contentment and peace. The party continued late into the evening, filled with laughter and music and the warmth of family. But for Xavier and Penelope, the greatest gift was simply being together, having built this life, this family, this legacy of love. As they grew even older, Xavier and Penelope spent more time in quiet reflection. They would sit together for hours, sometimes not communicating at all, simply existing in each other's presence. The silence that had once been something Xavier had to learn to navigate had become his favorite language, the one he spoke most fluently. In 1928, as Xavier approached his 71st birthday, his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual wearing down that comes with age and a lifetime of hard physical work. Penelope, now 63 and still remarkably vital, became his caretaker, tending to him with the same gentle efficiency she had shown in all aspects of their life together. Joseph tried to convince them to move into town where medical care was more accessible, but Xavier refused. He wanted to spend his remaining time on the land he loved, in the house he had shared with Penelope for 45 years. One afternoon, as Penelope sat beside his bed reading to him from one of his favorite books, Xavier reached out and took her hand. She set the book aside and looked at him questioningly. "I need you to know something," Xavier said, his voice weaker than it once was but still clear. "My life began the day you arrived in Stein's Pass. Everything before that was just preparation. You made me whole, Penelope. You taught me how to truly live." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. She reached for her slate, but Xavier shook his head. "You do not need to write anything. I can see it in your eyes, feel it in your touch. That is what you taught me, remember, to communicate beyond words." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead, then rested her head gently on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. They stayed like that for a long time, communicating in the silence they had perfected over nearly half a century together. Xavier lived for several more years, his health waxing and waning with the seasons. Penelope remained by his side through it all, their connection undiminished by age or infirmity. The family visited often, bringing noise and life and energy that kept Xavier engaged and interested in the world. In the spring of 1932, as the cottonwood trees were beginning to leaf out and Penelope's garden was coming back to life, Xavier took a turn for the worse. The doctor came from town and spoke quietly with Joseph and Clara, preparing them for what was coming. Xavier knew his time was short, and he faced it with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. He asked that Penelope be with him, and she settled into the chair beside his bed, taking his hand in hers. 75 years, Xavier said softly. That is a good long life. And 49 years with you. I am a lucky man, Penelope, the luckiest man who ever lived. Penelope squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. She reached for her slate one final time and wrote, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for our beautiful life together. I will carry you in my heart always." Xavier read the words and smiled. "And I will carry you beyond this life into whatever comes next. Wait for me on the other side, my love. We have more silence to share." As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in the brilliant colors they had watched together thousands of times, Xavier Owens took his last breath with Penelope's hand in his and her name on his lips. The funeral was held at the small church where they had married nearly 50 years before. The building was packed with family, friends, and people from across the territory, whose lives had been touched by Xavier's integrity and kindness. Many spoke of his love for Penelope, the example their marriage had provided, the way he had shown that true communication transcended words. Penelope sat in the front row, flanked by Joseph and Clara, and though she wept, there was also peace on her face. She had loved and been loved completely. She had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. And though Xavier was gone, the silence they had shared remained, now holding the echoes of their decades together. After Xavier's death, Penelope moved into town to live with Clara and Robert. Though she missed the ranch, she recognized that at 67, she needed to be closer to family and medical care. She remained active in the community, helping Clara at the school and spending time with her many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She lived for another 8 years, years filled with the love of family and the memories of a life well lived. She never remarried. How could she, when she had already experienced the greatest love of her life? When Penelope passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1940, at the age of 75, she was buried beside Xavier in the cemetery overlooking the ranch. Her headstone, placed by her children, read, "Penelope Brennan Owens, beloved wife, mother, grandmother." Her silence spoke volumes. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations. Joseph's children worked the land their great-grandfather had built, and they told their children about the remarkable love story of Xavier and Penelope, the cowboy and his mail-order bride, who had found something extraordinary in the silence they shared. On quiet evenings, when the sun set over the New Mexico landscape in shades of amber and gold, if you stood in just the right spot on the ranch, you could almost feel their presence. Not haunting, but blessing. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Their story became legend in Stein's Pass and beyond, a reminder that love takes many forms, that communication is about connection rather than words, and that sometimes the most profound relationships are built in silence. Children grew up hearing about the cowboy who learned to love the quiet, and the brave woman who traveled across the territory to marry a stranger and found her home. The land they had loved continued to thrive, the horses they had bred still carrying the bloodlines they had established, the garden Penelope had created still blooming each spring. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Xavier and Penelope were together again, sharing their beloved silence for all eternity. Their legacy lived on not just in the land or the family they had created, but in the example they had set. They had shown that differences are not obstacles but opportunities for deeper connection. They had proven that love is shown through actions, through presence, through the daily choice to honor and cherish another person. They had demonstrated that the silence between two people who truly understand each other can be the most eloquent conversation of all. In the years that followed, as the world changed and modernized, as the Wild West became history rather than present reality, the story of Xavier and Penelope remained relevant. It reminded people to look beyond surface differences, to value substance over superficial similarities, to build their relationships on respect and genuine understanding. Young couples visiting the ranch, now operated as part museum and part working cattle operation, would stand at Xavier and Penelope's graves and make promises to each other about the kind of marriage they wanted to build. Teachers used their story to talk about different forms of communication and the importance of accepting people as they are. Writers and historians preserved their letters and writings, ensuring that future generations could learn from their example. The music box Xavier had given Penelope was preserved as a family heirloom, passed down through the generations. Each time it played its delicate waltz, it served as a reminder of the love that had filled that house, the thoughtfulness of a man learning to express his feelings to a wife who could not hear spoken words of love, but felt them in every gesture. The writing desk he had built for her remained in the family as well, still sturdy and functional more than a century after he had crafted it. The wood was smooth from years of use, and if you looked closely, you could still see faint indentations where Penelope had pressed her chalk or pen against the surface, writing her thoughts and feelings, communicating with the world in her own way. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried forward the lessons Xavier and Penelope had taught. That patience is a virtue, that understanding takes effort, that love is as much about listening as speaking. They taught these lessons not through lectures but through example, just as Xavier and Penelope had done. The ranch house, carefully maintained through the decades, still stood as a testament to the life they had built. Visitors could walk through the rooms where they had lived, see the porch where they had spent countless evenings watching the sunset, visit the garden that had been Penelope's pride and joy, now maintained by volunteers who understood its significance. In the main bedroom, preserved as it had been when they lived there, a slate and piece of chalk rested on the bedside table, a reminder of how Penelope had communicated with Xavier. Beside it was a simple note in Xavier's handwriting, the last thing he had written before he died. "In the silence, I found everything. In loving you, I became complete." These words captured the essence of their remarkable journey together. A lonely cowboy and a silent mail-order bride had found each other in the vast expanse of New Mexico territory and created something beautiful. They had faced challenges and celebrated joys, raised a family and built a legacy, all while pioneering a form of communication and connection that transcended the spoken word. Their story proved that love is not about finding someone who is exactly like you, but about finding someone who complements you, challenges you, and accepts you completely. It showed that the best marriages are built on mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and the willingness to learn new ways of connecting. As the sun set over Steins Pass, New Mexico, more than a century after Xavier and Penelope first met, the land they had loved remained beautiful. The mountains still stood as ancient sentinels. The sky still painted itself in brilliant colors each evening, And the silence of the high desert still held the same peace and possibility it had when a young cowboy first learned to truly listen. Their love story, born in that silence and nurtured through decades of devoted partnership, remained an inspiration and a reminder. It whispered that true love sees the person, not the limitation. It demonstrated that the deepest connections are often found in the quietest moments. And it proclaimed, across time and space, that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones that are never spoken, but felt in the silence shared between two hearts that beat as one.